This is a film devoted to Jonathan Bowden's paintings. It is called Fenris Devours Odin. In Nordic, Germanic, and pagan mythology, Fenris is the great wolf who devours Odin, or Wotan, or Vodin, the father of the gods at the end of time. The end of time is called Ragnarok and signifies the end of the world. But in accordance with this essentially pagan or heathen cosmology, the world never ends and goes round again. The reason for this title is that it concerns the doctrine of power and its morality, and I would like these pictures to be a contribution to power in art. For my purposes, art is about the delineation of meaning and form. Art is radically non-conceptual in its objectivism. Art is about representation and about objective reality, albeit drawn in fantasy from the mind. Modern art has to make the world anew, given photography's replication of the world of sensibility as presence around us. In these pictures, ferocious and gentle, sexual and mythological, classical and ultramodern, violent and stoical, demonic, ghoulish, gothic, gargantuan, titanic, and ferocious, there is an attempt to attack the image and to attack the sensibility of thought in the image. This image is called A Jester's Pox. It's an expressionist image, and the background to it is reminiscent of the Parisian school immediately after the 39-45 war. People like Van Velde and others who circled around a magazine called Transition, edited by Georges Dethuet, with which Beckett was concerned. But I'm not interested in abstraction per se, and therefore there's always figuration. I would like my work to be considered as violently actual and representational. Here we have a longitudinal Lear, an alternative Joker, in a pack of 52 cards. This image is more classical and restful in form, influenced by the early stages of Leni Riefenstahl's revolutionary film about the Olympic Games in 1936 called Olympia. A version of the Parthenon is to the back. A Greek sculpture, slightly Medusan and yet proportionate in form, lies to one side on the left as the viewer looks at the image. But beneath both, and slightly to the right, is a mask, upturned, neither of tragedy or comedy, but emblematic of the Greeks, from which all Indo-European self-knowledgeable culture originates. This is an autobiographical piece called A.J. Bowden on Black. It's my father in a country and western hat, with an artistic mannequin or figurine, namely an artist doll, to one side, on the right. He was most concerned about the black, and said to me, "Why am I on black? Is it sinister? Is it nocturnal? Is it a colour that you want to indicate something by?" And I said, "Not at all. It just goes with the nature of the representational stroke biographical image." The artistic doll or mannequin was within my line of sight at the time of the execution of the piece. No more, no less. Here's a slightly cartoonish one, but it is meant literally and in a respectful manner. This is called Adolf and Leni, and is in actual fact from a newsreel footage, a piece of the time showing Hitler and Leni Riefenstahl together against a sort of landscape backdrop. The colours are non-representational, hence the turquoise or deep, post-purple-like sky, although you actually can get such representational skies in Spain, in southern Europe, against a ground heavy in iron and oxidised as to the viewer's resonance. The one thing I'd like to suggest is the extraordinary idealism in Riefenstahl's face, which, pursuant to her early films about mountains and her later films about dance — she began as a dancer — is emblematic of the sort of instrument of yearning which always seems to be part and parcel of her own visual forms. This piece is again classical in spirit, but with quite a lot of pastel in the middle. We have two masks, one slightly militaristic and the other thespian and theatrical. They stare out. They look towards the left as the viewer on the other side looks towards them. Here's a more early work with a certain sword and sorcery and frank Frazetta dimension. One particular rather gloomy, lugubrious and truculent hero carries a green man across his shoulder on a background of swirling, clarity red, purging into a purple lace blue. This is an ideological piece, which is a non-representational and themed colour portrait, in more ways than one, of Sir Nicholas Serota, the long-time sort of guardian and director of the Tate Gallery, now more commonly known as Tate Britain. He is one of the initiators of the prize which became known as the Turner Prize, and about which I made a brief film called, wait for it, Against the Turner Prize. On a background of ochre and yellow, Serota gazes out, unashamed, at the nature of his creation. This is a piece drawn from the ideas and iconography of Alexander Dumas, the man in the iron mask, but certain early Hollywood B-movies and silent films that depict the same line of imagery come into one's line of fire. A window, which slightly resembles that of a church or a cathedral, with stained glass colours delineated beyond it in projection, seems to have something to do with this picture up on the far left side at the top of the frame. Here we have a rather demonic and ferocious piece, rather reminiscent of these sort of Latino wrestlers and the wrestling bouts that I used to see as a child on Dickie Davis's World of Sport on ITV in the 1970s on Saturday afternoons. A man bays out his challenge to those who will come for him, wearing, if not a mask, then a mask within a mask that delimits the aggressive side of human personality. There's a certain joyous use of green, to my mind, in the background. Green, a colour of gentleness, the earth, eros, and quiet before the use of force. Yes, this is a rather psychedelic image, betraying a slightly post-dated 60s feel. A strong use of colour, strong representation, but within the image, not just between that which lies within and without. I've always felt that, rather like graphic novels, colour has to be used in a way which isn't purely representational but is emotional. In the history of modernism, there's a movement straddling the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century called Fauvism, where colour is used in not a disproportionate manner, but in a sort of surreal manner before surrealism was invented. So you have a movement like the Blue Horses, so-called, in German art, in the first quarter or so of the 20th century. It's basically just using colour, non-naturalistically, but representationally, partly to avoid repetition of purpose, but also to indicate new depths of meaning and to revolutionise the tired palette of the eye, particularly as it became inundated with commercial photographs and other images. Here's a totally ferocious one that relates to my most demonic period. Strong use of pastel, the influence of certain people like Bacon and, to a minor league, Sutherland and spiritually Balthus is present, but again the images are one's own. Such images essentially come from the semi-conscious part of the mind, but they also represent a tradition of strength. The purpose of the art that I've tried to delineate is concerned with power and the metaphysic of power and its reality. In a post-Christian society, we still look back to the art of a highly Christianized time, and Christian art had two most interesting polarities. One of them was Baroque complexity in relation to the depiction of angels and heaven and so on, ornateness, if you like, either virile with the Renaissance or overdone and Rococo in relation to Eastern Orthodox traditions. The other interesting polarity was the demonic. In this area, artists influenced by this narrative system were given total license to do what they wanted, and also a desire to luxuriate in pure ideas of power. In traditional conceptions, an artist was left alone to depict the Luciferic, or the ferocious, in Christian terms, as he willed, without prior cognition and without due culturalization. This meant that the diabolical side of Christian art is aesthetically, from a modern perspective, the most interesting side of that religion. Here is something called Anarch B-Man. Strong use of colour, strong use of overpainting on pastel, a certain totem pole element. But as always with words, they're inadequate to the nature of the image. The visual is a language of its own, in its own terms, on its own scale, by virtue of its own definitions. Here we have a rather early work that's slightly sort of fly-like or bee-like in form. It's called Arachnophobia, and it partly relates to a Vincent Price film in the 1950s, a classic B-movie of its type called The Fly that was later remade 30 or so years later. There's a bit of overpainting with pastel on the right side. There's a strong use of red and blue. I've always believed in poster-like contrasts of thick bars of colour on occasion because of the sort of visual dialectic they set up. Here's a later piece that's based upon Italian taxidermy. It's actually a black tie scorpion in a cage, which has been really delineated on purple or magenta. Strong use of pastel within the codification of the box that contains the scorpion. The scorpion consensus is obviously dead and has been injected with either prussic or nitric acid. The power and cleanness of the form of a natural tank like this is something which the picture tries to delineate. There's an element of non-representationalism both in the colour, which of course is false to the actual nature of the scorpion's body, an arachnid, a classic arachnid with 8 limbs which is dark black in its natural state, but also the slightly disfigured nature of the claws and other appurtenances which are unnatural. What's the point of replicating nature when the purpose of modern art is to express it anew and again? Here we have a work called Atonality on green with red depending. There's a certain auric sensibility to the backdrop because certain people's auras can be filmed, and red and green sometimes proliferates in sensual and yet philosophically proficient natures. It's partly based upon Schoenberg and some of his early and most extreme music. There's a version of one of the early pre-Viennese school atonal scores on one side. Atonality in music and abstraction in modernist painting are extreme forms of modernist art. They're an attack on mass sensibility, and in some ways they're a form of anti-bourgeois art form. The purpose of doing modernism from the right rather than the left is to insist that the world can be made again, is to insist on a new version of foreseeing, and is to insist on elitism in intelligence, in knowledge, in perception, and in the results of what's betrayed and seen. Here's, in some respects, a cardinal work called Behaviorism. It relates to a very early piece, which was a sketch before it was worked up into its pure form. It relates to the behaviourist school of psychology, which has now almost completely replaced Freudian psychoanalysis within the West, within the politics of both the left and the right. We see a sort of head screaming with joy or pain, it's not really clear, certainly not to me, on a background of hot and cool, red and blue, left and right. Behaviorism. Most of this school believes that human beings are taught very early to respond to stimulation and to avoid things, and if they're given punishments and rewards in relation to such stimuli, they will carry this forwards with them throughout life. Rats in mazes is sometimes the phrase that's used of the work of people like Skinner and Lorentz in animal psychology. Lorentz was a key individual in relation to the development of the current of thought, which became known as the New Right. But this painting, as always, stands on its own, independent of theory, just as an image. Here's a later work, slightly gentler in theme, based upon a painting by Blake, and yet transformed and transmogrified, in my opinion, several times over. God or the divine in multiple colours, with a sort of silken veil or scarf between two outraised palms on either side, lies over a man or some sort of humanoid creature who faces the ground. Two mock Grecian Socratic thinkers deliberate on either side. The world is made again. An old man in multiple colours opens his arms wide to create man. Here's a ferocious picture, but of a later vintage than the early ones, of a similar emotional character or intensity. A sort of Belial feeding a monster or a demonic labyrinth or cancer of forms crisscrossed in green ligatures or lines and tendons of imagined substance, feeds on some sort of voltaic form or kneeling initiate beneath it. Black is the background colour throughout. Although in some respects the sort of mosaic-like patterning and the extreme and non-abstract use of colour mitigates against the fury of the purported image. Yes, here is another biographical one on a darkish red stroke dirty scarlet background. It's a picture of the ultra right-wing and elitist writer Bill Hopkins. It's based upon a thumbnail sketch in charcoal and fine pencil from the mid-1950s by Pietro Annigoni, who was then very famous as the Queen's representational portrait painter, a sort of idealised photographic painter in the supra-representational tradition, stretching back to academic art at the beginning of the 20th century with people like Orpen, and then on through Singer Sargent, back to classic pre-photographic representational art. Now, Bill has always been an individual who's very important in my life, and merciless at the intellectual level. A man who, had this society not taken the liberal turn that it has after the 1960s, would have been a very important individual. Even as it was, the author of a famous novel, The Divine and the Decay, sometimes called The Leap, in the 1980s, and an essay of a Nietzschean compass in the 1950s called Ways Without a Precedent. Bill is one of the preeminent elitist and non-humanist intellectuals that Britain has produced in the 20th century. Born in Wales in 1928, approaching 80 years of age today, Bill is probably the greatest man I've ever met, and this picture is a testament to him. Here is an altogether lighter piece. My work is essentially, or quintessentially extremist. It tends to two polarities. One of them is sort of demonic fury and strength, and images which almost are the signification of a human sacrifice occurring beneath them. But there's another polarity, which is sort of Jackanory-like and childlike and almost silly, and slightly sweet, or involves just a patterning of forms, and relates both to the art of children and something which is called art brute, which is raw, slightly undisciplined, untutored art that comes straight from the semi-conscious to unconscious mind. Art brut as a formal movement, so to say, was a split from Breton surrealism and was led by a French thinker and producer of this sort of work called Dubuffa's Daubs, which he prided himself upon saying any 5-year-old could do, now average £86,000 at Sotheby's and Christie's auctions. I partly did these as an experiment because somebody said, do them as raw as you can, and there's loads of money in it. So I started. and did them for a span, but they represent an oppositional tendency in my own nature. That's why I rather like them. Here's another one that relates to the furious period of pastel daubs, a masked and slightly armoured or reptilian figure with a hook-like hand to the right, and a sort of sabre-like sword, slightly fishy in feel, approaches through a maelstrom of white paint on a background of fiery, orange-like or desert pastel. More birdies, swooning like molecules in a preservation dish. They pulsate, they glow like neon daubs. Tangerine bird is a go-go. They bob up and down like balloons. Possibly they're bouncy castles of one's own self. More birdies, with a rather penile one in violent red on a blue background. Others swirl around like the dregs of some aftertaste of dream. More birdies. This one was a sort of mosaic of sort of billiard ball type nuts that move about and approach a certain element of abstraction over time. Was I thinking of Picasso? Was I thinking of Jockey Wilson? Was I thinking of anything at all? Here's a more traditional image drawn from the heavier and more lugubrious end of Greek art. This is a Medusa. Such sort of pediments, such faces as part of blocks are to be found in Greek temples throughout the Aegean. A female form, actually, with a tongue extended from semi-reptilian teeth, and with mosaic-like eyes, and a rather satin-like and matted hair held in by a band. The saurian or reptilian quality is indicated by the tincture of green. Here's quite an advanced piece based upon one of the most famous fantasy pictures in Western art. It's The Temptation of St. Anthony by Hieronymus Bosch, and this is a very complicated piece within an even more complicated triptych. It contains the saint who's over to the far right with a stick, with a sort of woman leaning over him as some sort of helpmeet or Marian accomplice, but in actual fact she has a tail, and is a signification in Bosch of the reptilian and the satanic which lurks indivisibly in all other forms. We have certain false and fake apostles and sort of pseudo-Arab characters over to the back of the right. Whilst moving into the centre, one has a sort of table without legs that floats in the ether of its own accord and is a sort of reptilian and demonic in spirit as well as form. Over that you have a sort of transmogrified individual who's neither fish nor fowl, beast nor man. The most interesting figure, apart from St. Anthony himself, on the right of the picture, is on the left of the picture. In occultism, of course, left, sinistere, is the demonic tendency or polarity within the two halves or scans of hand, mind and brain. But this figure is a sort of walking reptile, some sort of mendicant preacher with one leg shorter than the other and with a reptilian and decidedly uncouth head. On the top of this there perches an owl. In Bosch's own visual lexicography, so to say, the owl is an indicator less of knowledge than of heresy. Yes, here's another image by Bosch, which is part of a famous triptych concerning his perennial theme, if you like, heaven and hell. This obviously is the latter. This is one of the most famous elements of a very complicated panel. It consists of a birdman who's atop a sort of throne, which is also a moral toilet, and he's eating one imagined soul that goes in through the beak mouth, and is then defecated down again into a sort of pit beneath, in a sort of bubble-like molecule. Around this figure, various other individuals play diabolical musical instruments, or go skating on pits of fire, or are sort of seduced, as the woman is, to the left of the picture at its bottom, by some sort of reptilian form. The colour, except for human nudes, is non-representational. Plenty of green, yellow, and blue. Yes, here's something called box malefic, which is a face within a square which in itself is contained within another square of fiery pastel. There's a certain suffocating and self-enclosed element to the conception. Green predominates in a non-naturalistic face. Rage, chaos, but not despair. One should never despair. Yes, this one is called Bristol No Regrets, and is partly based on My Father Gone Wrong, and sort of a metamorphosis of various energies. It began as one thing and became another. In this sense, there's a strong streak of actual ideological modernism in this picture, because after an initial phase, I wasn't entirely clear where I was going. More birdies. Slightly more redolent of Picasso here, elongated, chest-like, orange, glowing, day-glow-like on yellow. To say more is to be superfluous. Here we have the Magician, which is a tarot card called Number 1, the Fool of Wisdom, who goes forward into life with the belief that all things can be seen, known, understood, apprised, and reduced to his power. A long, spindly beard. A pointed magician's hat. Does it make fun of Waite's iconography, or does it wish to join it at a later date? This one is called Corbel 1, and relates to the gargoyle tradition, which is often found in northern churchyards and on the corners of sort of grey, slaty buildings in Yorkshire, up in Northumberland, and elsewhere. These images entranced Henry Moore as a child. Some of our greatest sculptors were the sort of men in these towns who produced these sorts of forms. Their names are unknown. They didn't even etch them on the basis of the form when it was placed on the tower. But the power lives on. And as the religion, which they were meant to exemplify in a grotesque manner, has died, these forms live. Yes, a welter of imagery in pastel, a sort of spectral and slightly demonic form, gazes at a stargate in the distance. An erotic image, Cruella de Vil 3, the first image devoted purely to Eros on the cool blue and the wild and fiery red that's come up for viewing in this film so far. An image of idealization, of desire, of the immensity and power that the female body always has over the male mind. This image, by contrast, is a Cycladic sculpture from ancient Greece on a cool background of radiant blue. Cycladic art is early white Aboriginal art. The features are not delineated. It's an extremely primitive, archaic, and sort of Chthonian or up from underground type of sculpture. You can see many of these forms in the early Greek and archaic Greek sculptural cases in the British Museum. Here we have one of the first pictures of Desade, the notorious sexual extremist and literary debauchee. It's called Desade Blue on Red or Red on Blue. I wanted primal, poster-like images with strong, vibrant, day-glow coloration. Desade is unusual in that no actual image of him, as delineated in history, comes down to us, even though many contemporary playwrights have written plays, like Marat Sade, for example, about his time, towards the end of his life, when he composed plays like Oxtian for the lunatics of the Charenton Asylum. His image remains fugitive or mysterious. Like the demonic itself in the Judeo-Christian discourse, you're free to embroider what he may or may not have looked like He's supposed to have been mildly effeminate and extraordinarily obese towards the end of his life, but remained throughout the aristocrat, seamlessly going towards death. The American poet Robert Lowell, in the middle of the 20th century, said of de Sade that he represented the violent unconscious of the French Revolution, and that something like the 120 Days of Sodom was, if you will, a dark, saturnine and poetic register, a sort of Baudelairean flower of evil, which was exactly the metaphoricization of Robespierre's terror in the year 1 and 2, between 1793 and 4. Here we have a day-glow de Sade that could have been envisioned by Warhol. Here we have another of the erotic images, blue and lightish, shading into pink-red. Demi-monde 4. The hint of unattractiveness about the form is indicative of the libertinage of the gesture. Here we have a demon bull, a confluence of sky sport and the negative side of Beardsley's art, or the openly satanic visual vocabulary that was put forward at the end of the 19th century by the Belgian Félicien Roop, or the similar artist and lithographer Olivier Redon. Another image which is slightly drawn from the impact statement of my own father, yet changed or transliterated out of all dimensions of prior strength. An image partly of morbidity and even of depression, but not necessarily in the subject or even in the viewer. The intimation is cosmic, the head shrunken. There's a hint in the treatment of Giacometti. Here we have a slightly lighter piece, a thespian mask, worn, partly in tragedy, partly not, to cover the features of an actor or performer. Found in a junk shop, the tassels are to go round the back of the head. The colours are non-representational, but the form remains clear. Here we have another partly erotic image. A horse's head exists between the woman's legs. The hair is red and fiery. The presentiment is sword and sorcery, or poster art, circa the 1970s, for example. Plenty of flesh is on show. I believe the title adopted in a moment is "Do You Want Me?" ? A reptilian piece which hints at the demonic or the third brain theory of man in certain ideas championed by psychologists like Eysenck and to a certain extent the explicator Koestler. The aggressive part of the mind is the reptilian stem at the bottom of the brain. Here's a celebration of it. Another image done at the same time, probably within months of the reptilian head just canvassed. This is a sort of iron-envisaged human form where the head is more important than the body and therefore is delineated almost without the body. The actual nature of the delineated face becomes part of its own landscape, so there's no actual distinction between background and foreground. Here we have an image which is very famous in modernist art because it's drawn from Epstein's early sculptures. This was my homage, stroke replication of the sculpture known as the rock drill. Yes, here's a mosaic-like pattern of 3-in-1 with a butterfly underneath on pink. The images relate to the tarot but are actually distinct from the same. 3 partly reptilian or saurian heads, one disfigured in the middle, look out upon you. What numbers, what fates do they signify? A later work done in a landscape style with a representational line but non-representational coloration. Here we have a slightly a sort of duller, dimmer and earlier work based on an image from the early 20s by Duchamp. Strong use of purple and green and red, an unusual combination without a tincture of the blue on brown. Here we have one of the strongest of the early pieces, called Ebon Tongue, a longitudinal and rather zombie-like head, triangular in tone and inflection, stares down towards you, but also at the bottom of the picture. Some sort of bow tie appears in a red mist at the base of this particular configuration. Bela Lugosi, from the early classic Hollywood film of Bram Stoker's novel Dracula from the early 30s, comes into focus and then dims away suddenly. Here is a work strongly configuring pastel, partly based upon the ideas of the French novelist Pierre Boulle, who wrote Monkey Planet, the work that originated that whole sort of popular cultural saga in and around the Planet of the Apes. A lot of paint on top of that which has already been done, relative heavy quality to the piece, even to hold. I believe it's a work where in every quarter of the square stroke rectangle which you look at, something is going on. A more classical, serene, and understated piece on a violent red which becomes dirty in the corners, partly based upon Arno Brecker's configuration of the classic in neoclassical guise in mid-20th century art of a classical, representational, academic and restorationist type. It's also reflected upon itself, a Nietzschean piece, melding into Leger's modernism, but striking out to depths which pre-existed. A tribute to somebody who vaults both the classical and the modernist configurations. This is a partly biographical picture of, to my mind, the great English sculptress Elizabeth Frink. One of her slightly titanic, monumental, solemn male sculptures is delineated in yellow on red behind her. Frink, rather like Leni Riefenstahl but in a modern context, declared that her entire work was a hymn of beauty to the male sex. The importance of the female eye in art is rarely seen, but its power, when delineated, should always be recognised. Here we have a slightly ancestral piece, England's Green Man, relating to various folk and or folkish traditions. Strong overpainting and the use of white as a surround upon a sort of dirty to orange-yellow plus red. A certain savage peasant ardour afflicts our Greenan, but he stares out more bemused than angry. Here we have a purely representational picture, which is relatively configured in both colour and tone. It's of the great German writer and diarist and war writer Ernst Jünger, although for the title of the piece I've anglicised his name to be Ernest Younger. I wanted in this piece to represent the fact that the English are essentially a Germanic people. Ernst Jünger wrote the most famous autobiographical book of the Great War called Storm of Steel, and rewrote it 4 times in subsequent decades after the end of the 1918 conflict. A dagger, loosely based on a Special Air Service Regiment dagger, and a smaller simulacrum float in mid-air. If you look closely upon the green, there's an insect, maybe a praying mantis, maybe something even more exotic, on Junger's exposed and outstretched thumb. He wrote extensively about insect life, and he harks back, in a science fiction novel like The Glass Bees, to Maeterlinck's work on the structure of the hive, earlier in the same century. Here's a very radical picture indeed, called Huijin Su's The Eternal Jew, an ape-like form gibbering in skullcap, with a robe of red, gazes out on Azure, fading into orange. Here we have a rather anatomical piece of work based upon the sort of death-in-life sculptures of Professor Gunther von Hagen, who has toured the world, the West, and even Japan with these anatomical exhibits of human corpses. Called, alternatively, body art or corpse art, von Hagen, who, like the filmmaker Cyberberg, was educated and brought up in the communist statelet of East Germany, now defunct, has devoted his entire life to exposing the naked human body beneath the flesh. Like Vesalius and Galen before him, and the core objectivism of, say, Gray's anatomy in both medicine and art, the link between the body and Western perception of form is crucial. We also need to examine the link that exists between death and art on objectivity. There's a strong strand of medical knowledge in art, and there are moments when art is closer to objectivity, to the harshness of visual truth, than science itself is. Here's an early form based upon a certain surrealist iconography. The vulva floats in a medley of force on pastel and green. A more codified, forget this daily star example of male eroticism. I've always believed that the female body should be approached in art, in life, in conceptual death. I have no truck with feminist strictures in relation to these desires. Pornography has to be confronted because it is part of the human mind. The only way in which it can be artistically transcended is for it to be turned into art or erotica. The criticism would be, as exemplified by a text like Kingsley Amis's or Lord Longford's Pornography, written in the 1960s, that erotica is just the pornography that artists and intellectuals are in favour of. But in contravention, I believe that a personalised form of eros, aesthetically delineated, is the way out of the pornographic morass, as represented by The Star and similar tabloids. Here's a very recent work, quite complicated in form, with a multiplicity of rectangles and oblongs. Some of them blue, others red, darkish to dirty green, on golden brown. An early humanoid fossil dug up, possibly from Tashkent or one of the Central African republics, counterfaces against the image of a clown. The clown, carnival, the show cry Barker's oration, the puppet, the marionette, Punch and Judy, and the use of folk iconography, combined with modernistic and elite culture, has always obsessed me. Strength is always in the art of the people, even though they don't know it's there on occasion. Here we have a piece called Freud Was Wrong. As with the other slightly iconic piece, Behaviorism, Freud Was Wrong on light green is painted in oil and indicates the neurosis of a reptilian presence. In Freudian psychoanalysis, people are supposed to go back to potty training to determine their faults. This is an image which has successfully overcome the prospect of doing so. Here we have Gaia make love to the earth, which is the goat of Mendes, and the head of a goat on white swirling paint based on a pastel ground or foregrounding. Strong use of yellow or ochre, which delineates the form pretty representationally. The horns, you will notice, are added in gold to brown paint as an extra swirl. Here's a biographical portrait of an actor who's known to me and who now lives in New York. His name is Eric Galati, and he's an Italian-American. The background of this work and the sky is partly taken from Bruegel's The Triumph of Death, which hangs in the Prado now in Madrid. Eric played certain Shakespearean roles like Macbeth, like Bottom, like Falstaff, like the Clown in Othello and other pieces. This is him as Lear on the heath, transfigured into desert. He wears green. He's surrounded by a populist and carnival-like tent. A fool exists on his right hand. Lear always goes everywhere with his fool. In Eric's large brown eyes one can configure almost the pain of the world. As the fool says to the Mad King in Shakespeare's play, "Prithee, nuncle, thou art an O without a figure. Thou art a nothingness." And Lear responds with the line, "Heed, sirrah, the whip." Here's an erotic piece, Genevieve's Night Out, on red and black. The eyes sparkle, but the breasts are revealed. Here's a portrait which is representational in every aspect on a deep claret. But the colouring, of course, is not true to life. It's of the famous early 20th century German playwright called Gerhard Hauptmann, who collaborated in particular with Strauss, and who also provided the words, or the libretti, for many of Strauss's modernistic operas at the turn of the 20th century, such as Electra and the almost divine Salome. This is my only abstract work, called, jokingly, "Give me $140 million. The title relates to Jackson Pollock. I think he's painting number 6 or some similar designation, achieved at auction. Possibly in Christie's, maybe in Sotheby's, that figure, which is in and around £78 million sterling. So I decided to do one, but so far it's not got up to that fiscal level, if you see what I mean. Abstract art has a power, but I've only done one of them. If the eye microscopically goes near a canvas at any point, you will actually see abstraction. If you squint and look at a piece of work, or pieces and spectrometer-like elements within it, you will see abstraction. But for me, personally, as with somebody like Francis Bacon, the painter, representational art is more powerful, because it happens to relate mentally to our kind of natures. But everything should be explored, and this is my one abstraction. Here is God Plays with Balls. Partly based, unintentionally, on a painter and sculptor I know, the divine aura or presence, or creative chaos at the heart of all forms of energy, plays with planets and interstellar systems, like a billiard gamester, tossing up his balls, at the base of which are several neoclassical and athletic sculptures, moving within cosmic wheels. Another erotic image or simulacrum intervenes, on blue, with a red disc near its base. This one is goddess, ape, sword, and skull. A black-tressed woman, ripe for worship. A postmodern Aphrodite stands with her sword. There's a hint, of course, as with a lot of my imagery, of the popular poster, elements of folk art, pulp book covers, and the graphic novel. It is possible to say I'm as much a graphic artist as a modernist one. Here we have Gon Batty, a delineation of those mammals that people think are reptiles and that fly in the darkness and are blind because they scream and get the reverberations back into those very large ears, which causes them to avoid objects. To the human mind there's always something ethereal and yet sinister about the bat. Gon Batty non-representationally delineated within the representation of form. Again, colour is used to express emotion or power, or break up the image, or draw the eye back to it in a more cardinal way. My view is that ad naturalata experiences, visually speaking, should always be celebrated. But if you want a representational motif of a bat, true to nature, pick up a nature book or watch a TV documentary by Attenborough about bats. Gone batty. Here is Grand Guignol, which relates to my second feature film with Andrea Leoi, the Italian director. Grand Guignol is the French tradition of Punch and Judy, and technically means great punch. We see the toy theatre above him, upon a ground of slightly violent and curving green. We see the thespian arch. Punch with his club exists below. There is a noose, which Jack Ketch, or the hangman, is always trying to get him in. Punch and Judy, a violent tradition, never a seaside amusement for children. Here we have a rather early work called Grimaldi's Leo, poster painterly, solid on red, yellow shading into orange, a pantomime lion, named after an Anglo-Italian clown, the patron saint of British clown and circus performers, Grimaldi, who dates from the beginning of the 18th century. Here we have something of the mannequin, but also of the mask, and even the psychotic delinquent, delivered in a sort of psychedelic dream. It's called Grinning Psycho and Dolls. What looks like the late 60s vision of some sort of creature in a creaking wheelchair emerges at the back, on black, through a spectral doorway. Possibly some of the erotic-laced poster paint art, itself part of pop art, by somebody like Richard Linder, comes to mind. A large number of his canvases and acrylic and spray-painted work, deeply formalist in spirit, was used on the book covers by Penguin for Vladimir Nabokov's novels. Here is a more traditional work. A happy demon frolics at the prospect of a negative ecstasy rather than equity. It's called Happy Hellraiser. Here's an image, green on red to orange by way of yellow fire, that was done in a similar time period to the previous work. Harlequin mouth delineates a mosaic of the heart of a mouth that sucks in the eye. The eyes are coruscated, hilly, one is above the other. It's not a mask but a face, possibly staring at the prospect of what it would be like not to have a face if one was a harlequin with one like that. Here we have a painting called Headless in Gaza. Another classical motif, although it really relates to post-Renaissance art. It's based upon the mythology in the Christian tradition of the head of John the Baptist. It's from a painting by Caravaggio. And yet in a strange way it's also transmogrified into a Medusa. So you have several ideas moving as one against a purple background. Purple, traditionally in Western art, the coloration both of imperialism and death. On a red and ovalesque foreground, Medusa's head, with attendant snakes, rears up in a saurian aspect. It's important to realise that these mythological statements come back and around. Although a middling to later painting, it actually relates to the more furious aspect of some of the earlier forms. Here we have a more jokey apparel. It's called Heavenly Droopy. I'm sure everyone remembers the cartoon character Droopy. This is a sort of bulldog of essence. These dogs, a cosmic one here, in multicoloured and psychedelic aspect, seem to exemplify a cosmic sadness. Folds of flesh and bravery compacted against two rectangles delineated by a black line. Above, there is a dirty yellow melding into orange. Beneath, a sea of blue. Here we have another of my tokens of appreciation to Hieronymus Bosch, in all probability the greatest fantasy artist who has come down to us in the Western tradition. It's again part of his triptych, Heaven and Hell, the panels dealing with hell. This is a work called Hellish Heaven 1, but it deals with the musical instruments of damnation, a sort of withering bellows or cranking sort of handheld organ. Is delineated next to a number of demons who are playing a drum. This is to the right side of the piece, confounded by brown, orange and red, whilst on the other side, amidst a demonic medley, an individual is trapped within the wires or strings of his own harp. Here we have, almost on cue, Hellish Heaven 2. This is a secondary delineation of the same Boschian template. We see a fish, stroke vaguely humanoid presence in the far left down section on blue. In the middle one sees some sort of Pleistocene fossil with what might be something of an old-fashioned musical instrument lying alongside it. Other strange anthropomorphic forms glimmer as one goes up towards the orange, yellow and black squares nearer the top of the piece. At the fountainhead there's some sort of reverse angel merging in with a bottle, carrying a shield, besporting, delirious, with both the alchemy and drunkenness of song. A quieter piece here. This again is a biographical portrait of the great British and English sculptor Henry Moore. A sculpture of the massively feminine, of the archaic, of the figures of the primal mother, earth mother and father, or matriarch and patriarch. Moore, the son of a miner from Yorkshire, a socialist of the old school, his brows furrowed, his fist in his cheek, dwells on great colossi in stone. He brings back the archaically primeval into the modern. A celebration on purple and green. Here, to my mind, is a very dramatic painting based upon the mythology of Salome. It's called Herodes' daughter, namely Salome. On the plate, in the middle of the picture, on red, and to the bottom, lies the husk of the Baptist's head after it's been cut off. Various patriarchs, Jewish court officials, and others circulate in the background, delimited in pastel forms. The great seductress, later crushed to death by the shields of guards, has danced the dance of the 7 veils to prevail upon her king, to give her what her mother wants. A more classical template, on a reverse zebra crossing, which is not entirely mathematically delineated, and which points askew to the right. An angelic horseman with trumpet, on a winged steed, rises up, its belly resting upon a strange and rather elephantine tin head, or warrior, beneath the stony horse. It's called Heroic Tin Head. And why not? Here's a more graphic novel delineation, even with a caption, called I Am Agron, which, as it's there already, does for a title. This again is taken partly from the exemplification of our contemporary Vesalius, or artistic anatomist, Professor Gunther von Hagen, one of whose forms was delineated earlier on, but it also relates to a thematic exhibition of pre-conquistador art from ancient Peru and elsewhere in what is today called Latin America. This was the culture of the Aztecs, where sculpture delineated not just the idea, but the practice of sacrifice. In their case, human sacrifice. Many of these exhibits also relate to the Royal College of Surgeons Museum, which is in South Kensington in central London. I went round this museum when I was 18. It's closed to the public because the exhibits are believed to be, traditionally, in accordance with the rather Protestant logic of the Anatomy Act, too horrific for the local public. The skeleton of the Elephant Man is in a case in that particular museum, together with various fetuses in jars of formaldehyde, malformed individuals, medical freaks, other chance discoveries and genetic hybrids, and so forth. There are a large number of sort of humanoid forms which are in themselves reminiscent of Belmer's dolls, for example, in early surrealism. Siamese twins and other freaks besport themselves in jars. This picture is called I Want Pierre Boulle. Boulle wrote Monkey Planet, which began that whole thematic course of Planet of the Apes type material. I think 5 Hollywood films, a TV series, various other things. Pierre Boulle also wrote The Bridge Over the River Kwai, so he was quite a gifted, middling sort of French popular author with an imaginative flourish. This is a squat, orangutan type, in lightish blue, the mouth open and gaping. Certain famous scientists like Richard Dawkins want to extend human rights to the great apes. This picture could possibly be construed as a critique of that. Here we have a truly ferocious and macabre work. Iron Breath, which comes probably from the period of sort of pastel-like demonic fury, my middle period, so to say. Strong amount of paint on the paper, overlying the pastel beneath. Some sort of cripple or cretinous retard with one eye larger than the other gasps in the midst of a metallic frame. It might be a development out of the fact that in Crowthorne, in Berkshire, there's the hospital for the criminally insane called Broadmoor. In Broadmoor, some of the most notorious psychopaths on the A-wing, or the one designate within the A-wing, have metal cages around their heads to stop them biting the ears of warders and fellow inmates. Here we have Jaktonoga, a demonic presence from the same period of Iron Breath and the other sort of ferocious pastel in black reliefs. He stares on, one of Lilith's children, one of Behemoth's retinue. Here we have a tribute to American popular culture, up to a point. It's called John Wayne's Green Berets. If you recall aright, Wayne made a largely forgotten anti-communist film, a western in jungle guise, where the Green Berets or advanced American paratroops fought the Viet Cong in a war where America was destined to go down to defeat. Here we have an earlier work, an African mask, Juju Jigsaw, a savage mask of death and transmogrification, a sort of initiatory covering of the front of the face. These masks usually represent an anthropological rite of passage, where you pass from any form of childhood into adulthood in one ceremony. The background is green. Fluff or fabric tapers from the bottom of the mask, which contains a lot of leather and metal. Mosaics transfigure the whole. Would you want to meet somebody after midnight wearing that? Here we have the return of an essential motif upon brown shading into gold. This is Punch and Judy. To have a bit of differentiation, we call it Judy and Punch. Notice that she is on the left side as a glove, puppet, and he is on the right. The left stands for death and transition. The professor, or the controller of the Punch booth, has both figurines in his hands, They're over his head in the booth, which usually consists of yellow and red stripes on Brighton seafront, for example. The children are screaming in front. The puppeteer, known as the Professor, sits in the booth under the stage. These puppets come up over his head. It's a celebration of what I regard as a major folk art form, the tragical comedy and comic tragedy of Punch and Judy. Here we have a biographical statement of somebody known to me. A few of my works are portraits, just as there's one abstraction, just as there are forms of art brut or child art, just as there are tokens of neoclassicism or extremist modernism. But occasionally I wish to do a relatively straight biographical portrait, nearly always of a woman, but occasionally not so. This is one of these pieces, known to me. On greyish black, one gazes upon the blue-eyed vista of the Nordic blonde. Here is a part of a Shakespearean motif, which consisted of two works spliced together and covering the same panorama, hence the use of the term diptych in the title of the work. It relates to Shakespeare's sort of middling and early tragedy, King John. Two guards, one larger than the other, one in fact a potential dwarf, under some arches, with halberds or sort of axe-stroke-spear weapons, gaze on. The other part of the twofold work is King John blinding the young prince in the tower, or attempting to do so. Here we have a simpler piece, with a transliteration in the ground behind the chess piece. A knight, knights don't castle, of course. The joke-stroke-axiom is that only rooks and kings can castle or exchange positions with one another on the back of the board. The planes alter behind the central motif. Purple limbs on. A pawn is seen on the back to the left, alone, waiting to be taken. Yes, this is perhaps my most emblematic picture of all, although others might doubt that. This is Kratos, which was probably first designed when I was about 18 or 19, and was overpainted subsequently. Sketches of this in an earlier modulation exist and are elsewhere on my website. Kratos is an image of fury that emerged in a modernistic way. I didn't entirely know where I was going, and so the architecture of the face and surround comes from deep within my own unconscious mind. The blood-red backing with green beneath is also surprisingly appropriate. On a point of notice, the term Kratos relates to a titan in ancient Greek mythology. It means pure power, the ecstasy either of a giant or a juggernaut, the immorality of the pre-gods, before the gods such as Zeus and so on, or Hera, that have come down to us, and at least have the possibility or prospect of moral consciousness. These titans exist before, in front of everything, including morality. It is interesting to note, as a byproduct of the above, or possibly a footnote, that when John Challis de Menezes was shot dead in South London at Stockwell Tube Station, the shoot-to-kill policy of the Metropolitan Police, as articulated by the Commissioner of that time, was called Operation Kratos. Obviously somebody at New Scotland Yard knows something about classical civilization. Here we have a delineation of Kratos yet again, Kratos 2 as against 1. The livery is different, the green has changed. The form remains, its treatment alters. Perhaps there's a softening in the fury of the blizzard which the image represents. Here we have a slightly depressive and mordant and Kratos. Kratos 3. A stepping away from the original fountain head or trough of fury. Here we see a Titan in reflective mood, surrounded by almost translucent and phosphorescent swirls of oil paint. A Leo or a lion crosses a zebra, namely a zebra crossing. This is actually based upon an image which is drawn from a form of primitive wood carving which I found in a charity or junk shop. The purity of carving straight from wood or from any other resource should never be lost. And although I have never practiced sculpture personally, it is truly a great art. Painting which overlaps with the corporeal and three-dimensional metaphysic of sculpture portends to the divine. One only has to witness, for example, the Renaissance work of Mantegna. Here is another classical motif proving that I am a conservative, restorationist, and partly traditional artist of classic vintage, as well as a modernist. A lion bites into the calf of a Grecian youth, Alexandrian in concept, held within a storm centre of lines, albeit within the heart of an orange rectangle. Leo discus bite is what I chose to call it retrospectively. Here we have Leroux's Gemini, a positioning of multiplicity. The two facial masks, one face, one mask, and yet reversed in a mirror of its own self, come together. There is a fury of paint in the surround. Gaston Leroux, of course, was the author in French Gothic or supernatural fiction of The Phantom of the Opera, a story which in turn led to the very famous silent film classic of the late 20s with Lon Chaney of the same name. Here we have Lion Hippo, again from a wood carving, similar to the lion wrought before. This one is more solid, less fugitive, less appealing to the eye, more monstrous, and yet statuesque. It's divided into rectangles of orange, yellow, and red. This should be called Kratos 4, but I've called it Loki's Maelstrom because it differentiates from the previous pictures of the same vintage. A fugitive Kratos now is beginning to disappear in swirls of black pastel, less formally delineated. He's becoming part of an abstract expressionist background of lightning and storm. A politically incorrect piece called Louisiana Lynching. A clansman's head in deep purple looks out upon a livery of light green arrested with fire. The mouth is a mosaic. Possibly it relates to the great politically incorrect piece of cinema from the tag end of the second decade of the 20th century just past. This was D.W. Griffith's film in 2 parts called Birth of a Nation. Ah yes, another erotic piece. A blonde, love ne supra, lassoes a willing victim. The hair comes down over one side of the face, the left side, to retrieve the pale blue of the resultant eye. An early piece, akin to the work known as behaviorism. And this is called lycanthropy now. And lycanthropy, of course, refers to the culture of the wolfman, as celebrated in popular fiction and would-be Gothic cinema. First came the idea, but the idea emerged in the markings. In this case, it is possibly a truly modernist work. On lightish blue, anti-therapeutic art capers before you. Another erotic piece, mildly so, possibly of a Swedish or Nordic-looking blonde, on lightish blue fading into pinkish red beneath. Mammary plus yield. One yields to nothing but it. Here is one of my religious pictures, on a palish pink to darker pink to red surround and backing. It's actually called Marian Holiday and relates to the cult of the Virgin Mary. From a block of alabaster or pure stone, her form, gentle as a synonym for the Universal Mother, peeps out amidst a mosaic of daylight. A more representational image follows it. It's called Marlena Hopeful and relates to a postcard image of the great screen diva of yesteryear, Marlene Dietrich. The hair is violently red, the look greenish, erotic and yet thoughtful. Here's another of my more iconic pieces. An even more boosted image of this particular presentation can be found on the Sarchery Upload Your Own Gallery website. It depicts the Marquis de Sade and is the second of 3 variants or takes on his visual delineation. This particular work, just called simply the Marquis de Sade, illustrates his mania, the madness of the swirls of yellow around him, the fury of the combative surrounds and asides. One eye, a monocle possibly larger than the other. He appears as a madly insane, erotic clown, with overly done and ripe red lips. This piece is a take off on Blake. It's called Matter and Antimatter, conversely, the one with the other. On a surround of lightish to darkish blue, an image of God with wings, contained in parallel bars of colour, floats over Adam or the first man. The snake of knowledge and wisdom curls around his lower extremities and limbs. Unlike a similar treatment of the image by Michelangelo on the roof of the Sistine Chapel, lightning doesn't pass between the fingers of one and the other. Here, the very temple of the humanoid receives upon it a gigantic grip. This painting, known as Mechanical Harlequin, exemplifies the artist's fascination with popular culture, with figurines, with dolls, carnival, circus, and puppets. A mechanical toy slightly sinister. This figurine also recommences and comes back and is in turn depicted in other pictures. One of them that I can recall off the top of my head is Eric Garlet's Lear, wherein this image, repositioned yet again as the Fool or Tom of Bedlam, associates with the Mad King on the Heath by his right hand. This was one of my early primal or cardinal images, which also spawned various parts 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. It's called Medusa Now Ventrix, and is a sort of post-humanoid, partly metallic, partly anatomical, partly related to the death art of von Hagens before it even came into mass consciousness, and I in turn was aware of it. Hands grasp at a face which peels away to reveal the brain and jaw of monstrousness. Yes, here we have a second version of Medusa Now Ventrix. It follows on before and slightly softens the issue, and in turn the image. Pastel is used in a more thoroughgoing way in this secondary motif. Yes, here is another, possibly not of the earlier images, but of the middling ones, but it portends, in my estimation, to iconic status. Known by my own reckoning as Mendes' Goat Boy, this mosaic depiction of the demonic with a sort of latticed eyes and mouth occurs against pure fire. Darkish pastel intrudes, both in line and in colour mass. Birdie's return, as an alternation of molten fury. One can only experience the architectonics of play school. Morbid, less in the viewer or even in the artist than as a projection of societal woes. A deep brown tending almost to black with an invisible grey, surrounds the piece. One half of the face, on the left as the viewer's eye looks at it, is non-disclosed, rather like the other side of the moon. One notices that the line here, and a form of abstract calligraphy, turned even on itself, is the purpose of this sort of work. I personally believe that the use of linearity is cardinal to British artists, in particular, stretching from the caricaturists of the early 18th century, like from the late 18th and early 19th century, rather like Hogarth, or Cruikshank, or Richardson, or Gilray, through to the Ralph Steadmans of our own era, by way of people like Roberts, Lewis, and Nevinson in the early part of the 20th century. A fascistic piece of iconography. This, related to Italian futurism, shows Mussolini on a background of green. Biplanes fly above. In non-representational colour, but represented effect, the architect of Italian Romanism in the 20th century, the world's first skinhead, glowers on. It's called, somewhat inevitably, Mussolini with biplanes. Another erotic piece. Napalm Blonde. Enough said. After all, it is on a background of blue. Here we have what I have chosen to call a rejected film poster. This relates to the film, which is available on Google Video via my own website, of a mask that is used by the central character in Venus Flytrap, on a background of pale and almost fluorescent yellow, reminiscent of the poster, paint, art and pop art of the 60s. This mask is delineated. It's open to form, heavily patented, representational yet luridly coloured. This is an early work called Neoclassic Hijinks. It partly relates to an academic artist known to me called S.H.P. Stedman. Stead, as some people call him, and as indeed he has called himself, was educated at the Royal College of Art and does super-realist portraits of a traditionalist caste, a classicist and a former member of the Grey Movement, a small artistic groupuscule that in British terms was related to New Slovenian art, that of course produced the rock band known as Lieback. Here we have more birds, themselves delineated on neon. They flourish, they relate to the art in the Maudsley Hospital, they move forwards to near abstraction. Yes, here we have another image, whereby a sort of Medusian figure devours a shadow in colour of the male. She bears down upon him. Gold surrounds her form, whereas his, tending to the right, is viewed with a dirty pink surround. Another word that relates to Marlene Dietrich. This one is called Nothing But Marlene. It possibly relates to one of those gaudy, sort of Persian, Aryan-esque and sort of fake Orientalist films that she made in the late 1940s, possibly with Korda and with other producers and directors. A reptilian form, strangely friendly in its allure, lies behind her. The eternal vamp never knows when to stop, being what she called one of her biographers, a soldier of love. Here we have a purely classical piece, which relates to a primary form of Hellenistic art. Hercules wrestles on blue, the half-man, half-horse, or centaur, known as Nessus. The whole point is to place a shirt, or restrictive garment, upon the creature, the shirt of Nessus, so that he loses his strength. The nudes are male, and naked even if half-horse. Olympia on blue is a tribute to classicism. Here we have a tribute, perforce, to medievalism. This is taken from Chartres or one of the other great cathedrals. It's a relief of the devil or Satan grasping a Christian interpretation of the Tree of Life. It will be three-dimensional, Gothic in solid stone, on a church spire. Violent red or scarlet superintends the whole. At the bottom of the image, a snake, the symbol of power in most Western forms of iconography, pagan or Christian, can be seen. An enormous dexterity of the mouth, underneath the flaming hair and wings, is also apparent. The extraordinary imagination, whereby the Luciferian influence is perceived in Christian culture, is actually a recrudescence of pagan lore. After all, one of the most interesting elements in, say, Mel Gibson's film The Passion of the Christ is his female or androgynous depiction of Satan. In this particular image, called Orgasm 1, we see the primary heterosexual impulse of the male cleaving to the female, and results of the same on red. Without such intercourse there can be no life. Here we have another of the more primordial or cardinal images which I believe that I produced down the years. This is a piece called Otto Dick's Eritrean. A skull, an anthropological piece with a limbered brain on fiery pastel, looks to the left. Otto Dix, of course, was one of the key, dark, cynical, highly etched, representational German artists within modernism at the early part of the last century. This relates to a classical painting in German and or North European art. Patcher's picture of a particular archbishop forcing, in that particular Christian iconography, the devil to open and then change the pages of his own prayer book. In the original, it's on a lectern. The bishop has his hat and his staff. The devil, of course, is extraordinarily depicted as part tree man, part human stick insect, part reptilian twig. It will be noticed that even his rectum, or anus, contains within it a lascivious face. This particular image is one of the most complicated and internally advanced that I've ever done. I thought, like Wyndham Lewis, with an image like the Siege of Barcelona, relating to the Spanish Civil War in the mid-30s of the past century, to delineate an enormous number of internal goings-on. It's called Papier-Mâché Heads Live! And yet it relates to a photograph, probably by Wal Lanchester, the well-known puppet master and punchman or professor, of a case of Victorian dolls. These are papier-mâché figurines and Punch and Judy puppets that date from the 19th century. One thing you'll notice is the grotesque, grand guignol nature of the heads, their sort of fury and macabre qualities. If you look very closely amidst the fluorescent colour, you can see the crocodile, you can see the negroid Jim Crow, Punch himself, the skeleton, which is supposed to be his moral conscience concerning the murder of Judy. You can see the bishop, you can see the policeman, you can see the devil whom he defeats in concordance with a non-dualist view of morality, and so on. It's the spectacle of Punch and Judy, which for the Victorians wasn't entirely conceived of as a playlet for children. Penile birdie. Orange on red, with pastel swirls. Surely more words are superfluous. Now here is another birdie, fluorescent upon yellow. It's called Piccadilly Circus birdie, ubiquitously so, partly because of the well-known semi-photographic images on the other side of Piccadilly Circus. If you come out of the station or its multiple entrances, you see the statue, neoclassical statue par excellence, of Eros, but on the other side there's an enormous advertising hoarding. It delineates Coca-Cola and sort of the garbage products of American mass capitalism. Why not chuck in a few birdies? Here we have Pieta. Technically not a Pieta in the traditional Christian sense, because in those images, the Madonna or mother of the presumed god is cut down from the cross at Golgotha, and she nurtures or cradles his doomed head in her lap, or similar imagery. An enormous number of great Renaissance artists, and artists of all periods, from Fra Angelico through to Buffet, say, with his stick men, Pieta, at the middle of the 20th century, based on existentialist discourse. A wide range of such artists have delineated the Christ figure. A picture on pastel, an orange and fiery ground, this, which has more to do with the crucifixion than, traditionally, any Italianate response to the Pieta, a la Mantegna, or Cimabue, or Giotto, or Velasquez, or any of these other masters. But still, anarchistically, a figure screaming and transfixed on wires relates both to that, to this, and to other images of mine, such as behaviorism. Here we have another in the sequence which is to do with Grand Guignol or Punch and Judy. Punch, on blue, at the bottom of the frame, lies, comatose, hence the title of the piece. Punch, lies, comatose, if you take my drift. He's outside the hand of the professor which controls him. Punch lies with a hand up on a yellow square. He's prone, dead, but because he's right-handed and spiritually represents the right within this particular iconography, he can never die. Punch is never destroyed. Above him lies Carnival, a lion mask, the wheel of the sun, and a depiction of the fate, the circus crier's mask. Comedy and tragedy combined in terms of the token iconography of the ancient world. Here we have another in the Punchinello sequence. It's called Punch's Tambourine. On a gold sky, with some mountains in relief, and green grass or wetlands before him, Punch looks out from a luciferic booth. Faces and masks in green and lightish blue adorn the whole. His depiction is beyond good and evil, beyond left and right, eternal in its ordered and yet chaotic prism. Here we have Punket, a vision, lurid, in divided ochre and blue shading on white poster paint from the late 70s and early 80s of the last century gone. Was punk a revolution, in accordance with the ideology of an Exitonian like the cultural critic Jonathan Savage, or just some white kids having fun in garages? Who can say? But here is Punket, tending to the left even though an eye drifts sideways, seeing what's really going on to the right of centre. Was it or was it not based, albeit in cartoon, on somebody I knew? Here we have Raging Bull, less the cinematography of Scorsese, and more graphic novel art, which reverts to the visual delineation of a Gene Colan or a Chris Claremont or a John Buscema, or even a Steve Ditko. The cry, "Yah!" in the corner right of the piece indicates the fulfillment of a graphic novel by somebody like Jim Aparo. Here we have Raptor Head, tending to an asteroid moon around a circulation of fiery brimstone and alternative notes, a head which is reptilian, bling-related given the neck chain, and somehow fossilized. A heavy use of white pastel overlay the original image. Here we have a scene drawn from classic silent cinema. This is taken from Fritz Lang's Metropolis in the late 20s. Rowohlt, the mad scientist who has a metallic hand, the first of many villains with metallic hands to figure in world cinema, confronts a state official, a sort of policeman, with his robot woman, his sort of Igor or plenipotentiary, victim stroke aide-de-camp, to one side. Metropolis. Adolf Hitler wanted Lang to be the head of the German film industry as a result of this futurist epic. Here we have an early iconographical picture called Rex Vivant. This means the king of the revels or the master of the dance. A modernistic work, it grew up autonomously on its own before I knew where I was going, and applied the orange or light blue. Here we have a piece of theatrical art, representational. It's called Royal Court Ballistic, and it relates to a performance, indeed I think the first meaningful performance not done by students, of Harold Pinter's The Caretaker. The Welsh tramp Davies, who searches for his identity via Sidcup papers, is played by Donald Pleasance. He stares into the foreground amidst a middling background of gold. In the background, Alan Bates throws the Buddha at the gas stove in order to smash any form of illusion. He plays Mick, the Cockney wide boy, Spiv, and Man About Town. Violence is always subdued. Inarticulacy of postmodern language. Pinter believes that humans don't communicate. They merely sidle up to each other with fawning mock aggressions, covered by comedy, silence, and menace. More birdies, to provide an interlude of throbbing, childlike pulsation. Think of a softball game crossed with a bouncy castle in a suburban garden. More birdies, more gardens, more balls, more toys, more laughter, more molecular, bouncy castles of yore. Here again, albeit the colour isn't representational or academic, is to my mind a biographical picture of the folk artist L.S. Lowry. Lowry, once despised, is now an icon of the popular art of, in particular, the northwest of England. Manchester and Salford councils, municipal and otherwise, fight over every canvas. He couldn't give them away, and they laughed at his work, but now each one is worth the better part of £500,000 sterling. But this picture is taken, probably by a Manchester Guardian journalist, photojournalist, towards the end of his life. And to me, it betrays what can only be described as an ineffable sadness. Sappho was married. Sappho, the ancient Greek poetess, the first great female poet in the tradition, on the island of Lesbos, hence the term lesbian. A heterosexualist image which refutes the ideology of the pink triangle, but remains loyal to her memory. Two female fawns swoon with butterflies on yellow and gold. Here we have a female bullfighter, I believe originally from Bolivia. A biography of her appeared about 30 years ago, with the frontispiece by the macho-oriented American popular writer known as James A. Michener. Hemingway also was in love with her. Franco, the Spanish right-wing authoritarian dictator, wouldn't allow a woman to bullfight in Spain, so she was essentially restricted to Latin America. Her face clearly delineates, in female guise, the mask of a killer. Here we have an element of Beardsley-like draftsmanship. The divine woman, relating, if only pictorially and metaphorically, to Rider Haggard's novel She. A blonde, on a stool, sits, amidst penile architecture, staring into a mirror. This work is an early and iconic feature. Shy Titan. A pre-god in Greek lineage, pastel upon dark blue oils, with one enormous cyclopean red eye, turns away from the viewer and hides in primeval shyness. Could it be the social insecurity of a pre-god? One remembers distantly that Mahler's First Symphony had the alternative title of the Titan. Those who came before the gods had even apprised the nature of their own barbarous morals. A profile here, fluorescent and fauvist, populist and highly coloured. Sibelius, the great Finnish composer of the early part of the 20th century. For some, the greatest classical composer in purely classical and pre-modern terms. Here we have another classical motif that relates to a particularly British or English field of sculpture. This skeletal rebirth, so to say, relates to the sort of thing you will find in many a Gothic churchyard. There's an extraordinary mausoleum-laced churchyard in Stoke Newington, in North Hackney, in central London. It represents high Victoriana, with these extremely Gothic mausoleums and heavy family burial places. They're redolent of the late Christian tradition, which was in turn very early within that subculture, concerning the resurrection of the body. You have these extraordinary griffins and angels on graves and dragons, an extremely luscious and romantic sculpture, which is regarded now as deeply unfashionable, yet is strangely arresting in its power, particularly as these places are often grassy and unkempt, and partly historically forgotten. Here we see an angel lifting the urn to reveal the skeleton at the end, in accordance with the doctrine of the second coming, allegedly to occur at the world's end. Soldier, number 2. On a pedestal, background of green shading into yellow, loam beneath, a soldier's visage, bulbous, non-hieratic, brutal, partly Elizabeth Frink-like, gazes on. Could it really be the nethermost face of Seneca's tragedies? Here we have another classical motif. Icons of this sort will be found in Greece, in the Louvre, and of course in the British Museum in the centre of London. Sparta, Sparta. My version of the 300. A Greek warrior looks out, from the side, with a hulking upper torso, one shoulder to the eye. He wears the plumed headdress, which is typical of all the warriors in Homer's Iliad, whether on the Trojan side, via Hector, or the Greeks, under Agamemnon, but championed by Achilles. Here we have an early work that relates to the tradition of the speakers, who were once icons of fury and the bizarre and the grotesque at Hyde Park Corner. George Orwell, the writer of Animal Farm and 1984, once described Hyde Park